Hello everyone, this is a continuation of our unit on interpersonal communication. I want to pick it up, the second part on how we communicate with others and how we express ourselves. Let's say, for example, that you take your significant other out to a nice restaurant one evening, and of course as you're there, there's something messed up with your order, something doesn't come out right, and how do you react and how do you get your waiter to pay attention to you? Well, one thing you can do is you can stand up and start screaming and yelling and call for the manager and make your protestations known very loudly. That's one approach. Now, if you've ever been a server, you know what it's like to be on the receiving end of that kind of verbal response to something that is wrong. On the other hand, if you are in a situation where you are on the receiving end, then somebody else may do that to you. So how do we express ourselves, especially when we're dealing with conflict, especially when we're in relationships that we have to negotiate our way through those relationships? So I want to talk about three basic ways in which we respond to each other. The first is entitled verbal aggressiveness. The second is entitled verbal assertiveness. And the third is entitled verbal argumentativeness. And for the sake of this presentation, for the sake of this class, I classify argumentativeness as part of verbal assertiveness, and I'll get back to that in a few moments. So what is verbal aggression? This is the definition of verbal aggression as found in the textbook. Verbal aggression is that which seeks to dominate at best, or damage, defeat, or destroy the focus of a verbal attack. So when we are doing verbal aggression, we may attack a person's physical appearance, we may attack their material possessions, we may attack their personal self-concept, we may attack their positions on topics of controversy or conversation that we don't happen to agree with. And so this is where sometimes we get into name-calling and we get into those kind of actions. We get into accusation, and the use of the pronoun you comes out quite a lot. When we were talking about logical fallacies early in the semester, an ad hominem really is a form of verbal aggression. You see it very much there when that happens, and you recognize it, especially when it happens to you. Very rarely is verbal aggression constructive. It's most oftentimes destructive and can be very harmful to our relationships. Set aside from that is verbal assertiveness. Verbal assertiveness is the definition. And the definition is kind of long, but I think the characteristics that you see on the screen are the best thing to remember. Verbal assertiveness is assertiveness behavior is that which promotes equality in human relationships, enabling us to act in our own best interest or to stand up for ourselves without undue anxiety, to express our feelings honestly and comfortably, to exercise personal rights without denying the rights of others. And that's taken from Alberti and Emmons' book entitled Your Perfect Right. And I think underlying this is not only does it talk about being able to express ourselves honestly, but that last sentence that I read, it's being able to express our personal rights without depriving or denying others of their rights. And so when we talk about assertiveness, we're talking about that kind of behavior which seeks to be equalizing in our relationships, which seeks to be equalizing especially in times of controversy. The third category I mentioned was argumentativeness. And going back to talking about what argumentativeness is, as we did earlier in the semester, and we talked about persuasion, argumentativeness is defined this way. It's a person's tendency to present and defend positions on controversial issues while attempting to refute positions which others take. So these are the three communication styles, and as you can see, argumentativeness really fits under that idea of assertiveness, because it's being able to once again express oneself honestly and comfortably without relinquishing one's rights, but also while respecting the rights of others. So there are important elements of assertive behavior. In order to communicate assertively, it's important that you maintain good eye contact with the other person that you're having conflict with. That your body posture expresses that, not of domination, but that of confidence and assuredness. That you maintain and understand distance as well as physical contact. That your gestures emphasize openness. That your voice and tone have good inflection. That you have fluency of speech, spontaneity of language, as well as good listening skills. So those are the things that go into good communication skills of assertive behavior. The aggressive approach, for example, is kind of the my way or the highway approach. It's using words like "you must," or domination, "you because I said so," or name calling, or using expressions like "you" or "always." The assertiveness approach, on the other hand, allows others, the assertiveness approach is willing to acknowledge when one makes an error, to stand up and acknowledge that, but it's also the willingness to express oneself with confidence and assuredness. Having talked about verbal aggressiveness, verbal assertiveness, and argumentativeness, I now want to move on to conflict in relationships. Conflict happens almost anywhere and can happen almost at any time. We can have conflict in relationships at home. We can have conflict of relationships in the workplace, and we can have conflict of relationships in the classroom. Basically, that whenever two or more people are gathered together, there is bound to be some kind of conflict in the middle of that. As the slide says, conflict occurs when the goals of interdependent people are incompatible and at least one person communicates to the others about that incompatibility. So goals are whatever each party is attempting to attain in the relationship. Interdependence is the action that one party has influence over the actions of the other. And until one person communicates about the conflict, neither knows that they are involved in conflict at all. However, there are phases of conflict. The first phase of conflict is the latent phase. The latent phase means that underlying conditions are present that could cause conflict. The second is perceived conflict, and this is when one or both parties become aware of incompatible goals. The third is felt conflict, and this is the emotional impact of perceived conflict. And then there's manifest conflict, and this is when the conflict is communicated to the other. And then finally, there is conflict aftermath. And this is what becomes of the relationship after the conflict, after you've passed through the time of conflict. So what might be some positive consequences of conflict? Well, first of all, conflict encourages solutions to be taken. Conflict helps to reduce stress. It helps to maintain relationships, but there are also negative consequences of conflict. negative regard, creating distance between two people, as well as when we have a conflict, it's much more difficult sometimes for us to retain or remain in a relationship. And there are different types of conflict. There's real and unreal conflict. There is content conflict and relational conflict. Relational conflict is conflict, or relational conflict and content conflict. Content conflict is over tangible issues, while relational conflict involves relational issues such as control or power. There is substantive conflict and non-substantive conflict. So there is potentiality that is harmful to the relationship, and non-substantive is not harmful to the relationship. So going about and confronting the issue. These are basic steps that one should take, or basic suggestions to dealing with conflict. The first is to set the agenda. And what I mean by that is when you are in a conflict relationship with somebody, or there's something that is causing stress in the relationship, and you want to settle it, it's important that you set the agenda. And part of setting the agenda is for you to define just exactly what the conflict is. Remember, you're focusing not upon the person, but upon the conflict itself. What is the issue that you're going to want to discuss? Part of the setting of the agenda is also establishing a time when you can meet with the other person. I don't think very many people like it when somebody says to them, "I need to talk to you right now," when they don't realize that any kind of conflict in the relationship is experiencing, or the cryptic messages like, "We need to talk sometime," oftentimes leaves you to wonder and perhaps even worry about what's going on. So setting the agenda is going to the other person and saying, "Hey, that you have an issue. This is the issue over whatever happened, and I really want to talk to you about it." And asking them, "Is this a good time? If this isn't a good time, can we talk about it later?" And setting up a time and place. And then when you meet, you want to make sure that you've outlined your concerns. And your concerns, again, centers upon the issue. And after the two of you have had a chance to discuss the issue, then you can try to come about resolution. An important thing about dealing with conflict and confronting the issue is always to assume positive intentions on the part of the other person. When you think that the other person did something purposely in order to harm you, then it's much more difficult for you to resolve the issue, because that is what is going on in the background. By maintaining positive intentions, then you are able to discuss it more objectively, openly, and more honestly. Again, there are different kinds of conflicts. There are behavioral conflicts, there are normative conflicts, and there are as well moral conflicts. In conclusion, it's important to remember a few things about conflict. Number one, you cannot control what another person says, what another person does, how another person acts. You can only control yourself. And second, you also need to be aware of the situation. Is this a situation that you are able to deal with yourself, or is it a situation that might be outside of your control? So remember those things, that you are a human being, just like the person that you are having conflict with. And that's the end of our presentation.